Hey guys, Warman here. Yep, we are talking about stuff with Medieval 3 once again. There's several reasons for why we're talking about Medieval 3 again. To be honest, it's a lot of fun to talk about stuff with Medieval 3 and to speculate on things. Another major reason is there are a lot of parallels between how we've developed stuff with this mod and how Creative Assembly is developing Medieval 3. So as a result, that gives us a unique perspective that we can bring to this discussion that no one else really can. Because before this point, our mod has been the closest thing to a medieval Total War experience on a more modern Total War engine. And that's about to change in a very big way, but there's still some parallels and stuff to be had. Not to mention, this also gives us an opportunity to talk about our own process for how we created factions and rosters and the decisions we made for all that. And this is especially prudent with stuff like the timeline and the time span, and we'll get to that when we get to it. And lastly, to be honest, the videos were very successful. A lot of you guys seem to enjoy what we had to say. They enjoyed the insight into our process. And on a related note, this is also going to function as an addendum and a correction to some mistakes and issues with the concept art video. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons, and God knows there's a lot of stuff to talk about. Because of all these reasons, we're going to be talking about Medieval 3 on a semi-regular basis on this channel. Now before you freak out, let me explain how this is going to work. Because yeah, this channel is about the mod, and that's still going to be the main content you're going to see on here. But what we're going to do is, once a month, at the end of the month, we are going to do a recap of all the news and updates regarding Medieval 3 and give our thoughts on them. Only one video a month. Unless there is something really important that we want to talk about sooner, that's going to be how it is. That way, it's not overwhelming stuff with the channel, and people can get their Medieval 3 content. And the other thing I want to address with this as well is, me making videos about Medieval 3 is not going to slow down or hinder progress with the mod, nor is it going to slow down or hinder progress of making videos for the mod. Because when it comes to the productions of these things, most of the work is being done by me. Aside from those recent cutscenes, I haven't done anything directly for the mod itself in years. I've been mostly retired, and I still am basically like semi-retired here. For a very long time now, it's been the other mod team members making it happen, making the rosters, integrating stuff into the databases, fixing bugs, working on scripts, you know what I mean? It's everyone else besides me. And to be honest, a lot of what they're doing is so beyond my abilities anyways. So I think that addresses all the concerns. I guess the only other thing to note is we are not the be-all end-all for this discussion. You know what I mean? Like, there's always going to be plenty of different opinions and perspectives. We are modders, not historians, nor are we game developers, but I like to think that we can bring a unique perspective to this all the same. So, with that long preamble out of the way, let's get into the news, and God knows there's a lot to talk about here. So, this video is probably going to be even longer than the others, and I'm going to try not to ramble with this, and I'm going to try and go about this in a way that's coherent as possible. Unfortunately, there's a lot of stuff that's like interwoven into each other, and it's like there's like a starting point to this conversation, and I can take that in multiple branches, and it's hard for it to curve back around, so just bear with me, everyone. Okay, where do we start? I suppose we can start with some corrections and clarifications regarding the concept art video. First of all, again, I can confirm that Creative Assembly has seen this video and they made a response to it on their forum, because I posted the video on their forum, and yeah, they responded to it, and we'll go over some of that later. There's definitely some very interesting stuff to discuss with this. There's stuff to talk about regarding this game's time frame, as well as the recent live stream. There's a lot of stuff to talk about. Starting with corrections for the concept art video, we're going to be spending a lot of time on this piece of concept art in this video because, well, this is where most of the mistakes I made came from. Sadly enough, I gave it way too much credit, and again, I don't mean to be snide with that, but that's just the ugly truth of it. I'm putting a comment on screen from a actual historian talking about all the issues with what Creative Assembly did with their units, including the concept art of what I think is supposed to be a pike unit. Yeah, basically we gave it too much credit. The long and short of it is, again, pause to read this comment because it goes into better detail about it than I ever could. But what they said and what we kind of realized upon further examination is that this is a mess. This is actually a mess in a different way from like the Osprey stuff. It's basically like a mishmash of stuff from like the 1470s and the 1480s. So yeah, while it doesn't look bad by any means, I feel like it still looks better than the Osprey stuff. It's not historically accurate. And unfortunately, unfortunately, if what this guy is saying is true, they don't have any historians from Iberia working on this game. Oh, and by the way, Creative Assembly, since I know you're probably watching this, first of all, hi. This guy sent you an email. See if you can find it in your database. It might be something to look into. And if we're talking about stuff regarding historians, we would also like to recommend the works of Sir Tobias Capwell. He is a reenactor and historian. He has a lot of books and subject matter that goes into a lot of stuff, like there's a thing called The Armor of the English Knight. And by the way, Sir Capwell has given his stamp of approval over some of our Holy Roman Empire units. Seriously, this is a thing that happened. Here's proof. So take from that what you will. Again, the mileage varies in terms of accuracy regarding our stuff as well, so don't take this as the be-all end-all for everything, but at least with this stuff, yeah, we're on the right track apparently. Going forward, when it comes to talking about the concept of Medieval 3 and accuracies and inaccuracies, we're going to make a point to talk to actual historians like this guy here in order to make sure that what we're saying is correct, at least to the best of our ability, before we say anything definitive. So yeah, that's basically how we're going to handle things going forward with that. There's still a lot to talk about with this armor and just the overall approach to how units should look for the decade of the century they're supposed to be. But before we get into that, we need to talk about the time span that this game is apparently most likely going to be taking place now. Because Creative Assembly, much to my personal surprise, made a forum post talking about this recently. They're looking at the time frame of 1140 to 1440, so 300 years of history, starting just before the Second Crusade and ending just on the cusp of like the end of like the 100 Years' War. So there is a lot to talk about with this, even before we get back to the armor stuff. I'm aware that there are some people that want the game to start earlier and end later. I mean, I personally think this is actually a very good time span to have, and this is where our unique perspective from working on this mod kind of comes in handy. I don't think people understand that if you want to have these games be historically accurate, if there's a trade-off with that where you have to put more effort into it and be more specific and just more detail. Like Medieval 2 was able to get away with such a long time span because they cheated things hard and a lot of stuff was not historically accurate in the slightest. They just had a single faction for Spain, they had a single faction for Egypt, they had a single faction for Turkey. There were major factions that simply were not there at all, like the Kwarmazanians. Seriously, you just had Russia. I could go on. And the rosters were comparatively minimal. They had to cheat things in a very big way. And large chunks of the map were rebels. They weren't even like actual factions. There's no way Medieval 3 is gonna do that again. You don't fully appreciate how difficult this is gonna be unless you've done something like our mod. Because for all intents and purposes, we are basically making 3 rosters per faction. Although there's a slight asterisk under the definition of faction there. Again, we'll get to that later. And some kingdoms and regions are so much more difficult than others. Some kingdoms like England and France are obvious. What about Sicily? What about the Seljuks? What about the Fatimids or the Ayyubids? What about the Ghurids? What about the Khwarezmians? How even stuff like the Mongols? So much of Europe was under constant upheaval. How about the fact they had Spanish kingdoms joining together later on? The Holy Roman Empire was a mess that had a lot of changes. Some stuff like the Maritime Republics is relatively intact, but you know what I mean? There's so much stuff that it's like if you actually go beyond multiple centuries, you run the risk of entering speculative territory, and that could be such a mess. The way we kind of handle this is basically we just kind of like only had the changes of leadership at the top and just sort of had the later tiers more based on certain things. That's how we handled things with the Seljuks, but to be honest, that was far from perfect. And again, a ton of work. The Ottomans are very different from the Seljuks. Mamluks are very different from the Ayyubids and the Fatimids. I mean, we have some theories on how Creative Assembly is going to go about this, but still, people don't understand how difficult this is going to be. And that's for 300 years of history. Medieval 2 was 450. I'm being very passionate about this because people don't understand how this works and how difficult it is. It's easy to just demand an earlier start date. It's easier to demand a later start date, but unless you're actually in the trenches, you don't know what you're asking for. Having things be historically accurate and that long span of time takes a long time. I mean, we can get away with it because we're modders. We do this in our free time. So if it takes us a long time to get something done, that's fine, but a game is a different beast with different priorities and deadlines. I didn't mean to get so passionate about this, but you can see where it's kind of frustrating because I just see people demanding earlier start start dates without understanding what that entails. And adding on to that is that our starting year was very late. If we're talking about stuff in the 1100s, that has a whole other thing that adds to the dynamic. You don't have the Ayyubids, you have the Fatimids. Seriously, you have more Crusades. You have all this other stuff. Now, one big difference between our situation and Creative Assembly's situation is the fact that they have a new engine. And they keep saying that this engine is crucial for how they're going to make Medieval 3 happen. And based on what we've seen so far, that just might be their ace in the hole to be able to do a lot of stuff. But even considering all that, this is why I've made my peace about the fact that this game is probably not going to be historically accurate despite our best efforts. Why there's probably not going to be certain major factions playable at launch. While the visual variety and variance in the units is probably not going to be as extensive as our mod. I've made my peace with all this, because I understand that even with a new engine, there's only so much they're gonna do. There has to be a trade-off here if people want to actually play the game before 2030. And I know for a fact there have been people who have been saying that. So yeah, I think the way Creative Assembly is handling the time span is mostly fine. I do have a slight issue with this, but we'll get to that in a sec. I think this time span is a very good one to have. I know some people want to have their own first crusade and stuff like that. I think just as many people though wouldn't mind just playing as Jerusalem or Antioch, if our mod is anything to go by with this. I find the fact that it's 300 years to be very interesting, because that is almost exactly the same span of time as our mod. Can't say how I know this, but I know the Med3 team has looked at our mod in some way. It would be supremely arrogant to say that, oh, they were inspired by our mod with this. However, I feel like when they were trying to deliberate the process of how they wanted to go about things with the time span, I do think one of the things they looked at to get to that decision was our mod. And I think the end result is a time span that's effectively a hybrid of Medieval 2's time span and ours. I think the biggest thing they took away from our mod is the idea of it being like 300 years, but they wanted to start it earlier than 1212, which makes sense. Like starting it in the 1100s makes way more sense. You have stuff like more crusades, you have iconic historical figures. That makes perfect sense. There was never going to be a version of this where it's like, oh yeah, they're going to start the game the same century as our mod. That was never ever going to happen, nor did anyone want that. And this is definitely a coincidence. I do find it interesting how this Medieval 3 start date is effectively halfway between Medieval 2's start date of 1080 and our start date of 1212. It's almost exactly in the middle between both those starting dates. Again, which is why it almost leads it to like the fact that Medieval 3 is like a hybrid of both approaches. Now again, this is far from perfect, and especially when it comes to the end date of this. Some of the other mod team members feel like it would have been better if the game ended at 1453. Because that's like the fall of Constantinople and the end of the 100 Years' War. I personally think that somewhere closer to 1490 might be a little bit better, although that might be a bit ambitious, especially when you consider what I said and just the nature of how armor progression works. However, 1490 would still be before the Age of Exploration stuff, and to be honest, they already seem to be making assets that are toward the latter half of the 1400s anyways, because as I said already, the armor seen here is a mishmash of stuff from the late 1400s. That would be very anachronistic if the game ends at 1440. So if you're already making the assets for stuff later on anyways, you might as well base your 1400 stuff off the latter half of the century instead. And we'll get to that in a moment. I think they're going to lengthen the campaign a bit into later on into the 1400s, because again, they were asking for feedback on this. But even if they don't do that and we have a lot of the later units looking anachronistic, I'll say right now, it's still better than other Total Wars. When it comes to portraying the proper armor and weapons and stuff in these games, if you want to be historically accurate, it's actually more complicated than you might think. The nature of armor throughout the centuries is actually surprisingly complicated, and even within the same century, depending on when you're looking, like what decade, you'll find wildly different things. Like I keep saying, early 1400s is different from later 1400s. When they're talking about the more iconic stuff from the 1400s, Gothic plate, the Milanese plate, or the kind of armor you see like in the War of the Roses, we're talking about stuff in the latter half of the 1400s. Those things were not around in the beginning of the century. You know what I mean? Like the kind of gear that like the English and French would have had in the latter half half of the 100 Years' War would have been different from what they had later. And take this mindset and apply it to the whole area that this game is probably going to be taking place in. And hell, even going to like earlier centuries, you have a similar thing. Like for example, the iconic look of the Great Helm Knight comes from roughly the 2030s to the 2070s, as you see in the, forgive me, I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, the Majowski Bible. Every 30 to 50 years, you could have like a noticeable shift. Early 1200s is different from later 1200s. Same with the 1300s, like 1100s, etc. And even what I'm saying right now is oversimplified, as any armor expert who's watching this is probably already noticing. Yeah, I'm fully aware that this is oversimplified. That's part of the clusterfuck when it comes to making an accurate portrayal. And also why I made my peace with the fact that there's going to be a bunch of stuff that's inaccurate with this game, and why mods will always have a place in Total War to fix the issues with inaccuracies. And you better believe this is something we've struggled with as well, okay? Like, pretty much everything we're talking about with Creative Assembly's approach, we've also grappled with too. And depicting things at the right point in the century has always been a mess with us, okay? We've struggled with this quite a bit. It would have helped us out a lot if we had a better idea of what we were doing with that. If we had decided properly to focus on the pitching of, like, say, the 1200s on a certain group of decades, like, again, the 1230s to the 1270s, it probably would have been more coherent for us. Same with, like, something with the 1300s. The 1400s, we would probably base it on the latter half of the century. You get the gist. And that's also why I'm saying that Creative Assembly probably should base their 1400s units off the latter half of the century. I think that might be better for them because it gives them an excuse to have the more iconic Gothic plate, the Milanese plate, again, all the other stuff that they clearly want to have in this game. By extending the end date by just a few more decades, I feel like it would kind of make everything a little bit smoother and cleaner and tighter. Again, very ambitious. The only reason why I'm saying they should extend the end date is because they've already been leaning toward that anyways. And I also want to reiterate getting the assistance, or at least reading the books of Sir Tobias Capwell, because he knows his stuff. He's done a lot of the heavy lifting with this anyways, so I feel like that could be a good point of reference for Creative Assembly to go off of. So I want to kind of like bring us back to this statement that Creative Assembly made in response to our concept art video, because there was some very, very useful information. Again, I'm gonna have the statement on screen for you to read. This was really cool that they responded at all, okay? Like, this is really, really nice of them. This is a step in the right direction. It's good to see that Creative Assembly is leaning into this as much as we are. They were kind enough to explain what was going on with the disparity between the two kinds of concept art. But the long or short of it is, essentially, this art here is more finalized, and this is also, like, I think, a pike unit. We have some dispute on whether or not a pike unit should be this heavy, but whatever. This piece of character art is basically more of like what they're calling a thumbnail thing. Basically, just like they wanted some kind of image to, as they said, look at the roster with, to try to figure out how big these rosters are going to be and how they're going to change over the centuries. I presume that they were just going with the Osprey stuff Holcroft then, just so that they can like have something physically there to look at. And they made it abundantly clear that the weapons and shields are just there for the shape and profile and not trying to be reflective of anything that's actually going to be in the game. I mean, that's still a little bit weird because a rounded heater is a different kind of shape than this, but whatever. And what they were saying about how actual Castellan units would look a bit different and more colorful gives us some hope that they're going to be more accurate in this regard. We shall see. It's interesting to see how they're kind of approaching the whole dynamic that I was mentioning about how like you're kind of making like 3 different rosters if you have multiple centuries like this. This gives the vibe that's similar yet different to our tier system, and it's probably going to lean more to the different side of things because again, it's a new engine. I'm very curious to see how their gameplay design and their engine could hopefully lead to a system that makes it easier for them to do rosters better than us. That's one of the biggest things I'm so excited for to see, like, because they seem to imply that there's going to be like some kind of progression here, like a path. I'm curious to see how that's going to manifest in game. I'm hoping that because this is something they're doing from the ground up, that they'll have an easier time going about this than we did. And on a related note, they also mentioned how they're approaching rosters, how it's something more tied to culture and less specific factions. And I know some people might think that sounds kind of weird or problematic, but it really isn't. The only way I can see this a problem is if they, for whatever reason, have like all the troop types in Western Europe look the same. In other words, if they use like the same unit models for France that they do for the Iberian factions, that's the only way I can see this being a problem. For the most part, the vibe I'm getting is Creative Assembly is not going to do that though. The only exception to this is the term Iberian Sergeant here, but again, given the nature of what this is supposed to represent, I don't think this roster structure is remotely finalized or anything of the sort at all. They seem to imply that the rosters are going to be set up by like culture, so even if there's like common ground in terms of the unit function, they're still gonna look different. I'll tell you what this all reminds me of. This reminds me of how we did a lot of things with the Iberians. Now the mileage varies with this in terms of the most literal, like exact replica thing of like what I think Creative Assembly is going for. You'd have to look at the Maghrebi factions, aka the Almohads, the Hafsids, and the Marinids. Did you ever wonder why, when I did that faction preview video all those years ago, I did all 3 factions at once? It wasn't to be lazy or to arbitrarily group things together. It's because they share a lot of the same units. That's just the truth of it. There's a lot of common ground culturally in terms of how they fought. They all fought very much the same with the same kind of troops. There are plenty of exclusive units, but there's enough common ground that it just made more sense to do it that way. And to a lesser extent, you can also see this with Aragon and Castile. And just like with the Maghrebi factions, yeah, Castile and Aragon do have some exclusive units, but for the most part, they are very, very similar. For this example, I'm going to talk about the Tier 1 swordsman unit for both factions. Under the hood, they are separate units, but visually, as you can see, they look identical, just with some different emblems. And they have the same stats too. The reason why these units are separate is because it is the only way we can give them their proper standard bearer, so that the Castilian unit has the Castilian flags and the Aragonese has the Aragonese flags. But again, with a different engine, Creative Assembly may not have to do that. They can do it in a way that's more natural and better. We have already been doing what Creative Assembly seems to be leaning towards here. For example, the recent revamps with the Scandinavian factions. Denmark, Sweden, and Norway have very similar rosters. There are some unique units in there, don't get me wrong, but there is a lot of common ground. A lot of it is just tweaks in the gear, as well as like the emblems and the coats of arms featured. Again, they're not true clones, but they have a lot in common that you kind of do them together. When we eventually go to the Russian factions, it's going to be the same thing. We have new models in the works for the Khwarezmians and the Gurids, by the way. And again, it's a similar thing where it's like we're treating it as like the Persian region. I think this is a good approach for Creative Assembly to do, because that might give them the opportunity to, superficially anyway, have more factions on day 1 than any recent Total War title. Because what I think they might end up doing, again, this is just speculation on my part, I think they're going to have cultures set up like races in Warhammer. And again, I know that sounds bad, and it's not going to be exactly the same as that, but that's the closest analog I can give for what I think they're going to do here. I think that there's going to be 5 or 6 cultures on launch, and each culture is going to have 2 or 3 factions in it. And in this setup, the factions are basically going to be like de facto legendary lords. Again, I'm not saying it's going to be character focused, I'm just using that as the closest analog. Again, this is just me spitballing and speculating based on what I've seen, because I'm just very intrigued on how factions are going to even work in this game. Like, when you actually stop and think about it, we really don't know that much here, and what we do know from Creative Assembly just makes things more interesting and intriguing to see how things are going to shake out. Seriously, there was a good forum post here. Pause to read this, okay, because there's a lot to talk about with this alone. But in essence, they're talking about how you can change the nature of your factions quite significantly, and they also expressly mention flexible systems. Given how certain factions and kingdoms were at the time, how decentralized stuff things were, and when you combine it with what they said in other posts about unit rosters being able to borrow from each other, I think the concept of a faction as we know it is going to be very strange, very flexible, and very interesting. I look at stuff with England and France because you have like families that are like in both kingdoms that were trying to control both kingdoms. Is that going to be reflected in Medieval 3 at all? And if so, how? I'm very intrigued. And there's also hints that you can welcome certain things, which may be how they're going to try and integrate like emergent factions in a sense, where if you're playing against the Fatimids or the Ayyubids, you can, I guess, welcome the Mamluks or something here? They seem to imply that you can change factions significantly if you give it enough time and effort. I cannot but wonder if this is how they're trying to address some of the issues we mentioned earlier in the video. And real quick, this is a mock-up I found on the Reddit. I have some issues with this map. I feel like there's some regions that need more factions, and as much as I would love to see all these factions playable, I don't think it's going to shake out that way, sadly. At least on launch, although I would love Creative Assembly to prove me wrong. But I do like the idea of having Anjou being a separate playable faction from England and France. Again, just because of the significance of the House of Plantagenet and how it affected stuff with both kingdoms. I feel like making it be a separate faction that you can play as is a good example of what I'm talking about when it comes to potential flexible systems. Again, with a new engine, anything is possible. I feel like we can use this to kind of like segue into stuff with the stream. So first of all, this was really damn cool. I hope to see more of these. This was such such an interesting experience. I actually was there live for it. Although, if I can be honest, if I ever watch this live again, I'm probably gonna mute the chat. Seriously, there was so much goddamn cancer. Just in general, I have nothing but sympathy for Creative Assembly because God knows there's just a lot of unhinged nonsense being thrown their way. Seriously, you guys have my sympathies. If this chat was anything to go on, you have to weed through a lot of nonsense. But anyways, back on track here. I feel like it's also important to mention how promising it is that they said that they're going with the Attila map, except it's going to be way more detailed. Like, again, that all sounds so promising and so cool to see, and I can't wait to see how this develops. Now, of course, the stream wasn't perfect, again, just due to the nature of what this is. There's a lot of stuff that's simply hard to judge or gauge right now. Another point of criticism I saw some people bringing up is the fact that there's a lot of cities and settlements not in the right place yet. I'm pretty sure this is just a mock-up and they're going to make it more accurate later. I hope that's the case, because otherwise, well, all stuff's not accurate too, but we have an excuse. I don't know if Creative Assembly really does with this one. But again, there was a lot of cool stuff to digest here. Pretty much everything about how they're doing the regions this time has been nothing short of incredible. Like, there's a lot of promising stuff here. The fact that it's no longer the province system, the fact that there are limitless slots. While I think you could put down castles before, you couldn't put down ports. And the fact that you can just turn these places into mega regions and stuff like that is really, really cool to see. Some people said that the system is very similar to how they had it in Empire, Total War, or Shogun 2, albeit with more depth. I've never played either of those games, so I don't know for sure about that. From what I can tell, this is definitely more detailed than anything we've had before. And once more, I feel like some of this could be based on the fact that it's a new engine. Again, I bring this up for a reason because it really is going to be helpful to make this game so much better than what our mod could ever do, at least in theory. Because yeah, our mod also has single region settlements, but comparing that to this feels like an insult. And this is very early on, and it still has so much more potential for customization, for depth. The fact that you can place things the way you can, this is incredible stuff. It's also pleasing to see population come back, as well as like with different population types. We would like to recommend that they add a couple more types though, notably like for other cultures like tribesmen and slaves, which is something that we have for our game and for a good reason, because those bring different dynamics to the situation. Like, for example, you kind of need slaves for like the slave soldiers, like the Mamluks. You know what I mean? That's a very different pool of manpower for those units in those regions. Another thing that kind of surprised me was the fact that they were asking questions in such a very formalized manner, and there was like a bunch of them. And you better believe that I responded to all these on the forum. I would go into what we said for each question, but you can find it on the forums, and to be honest, if I were to do that, we would be here all day, and this video is already insanely long. And to be honest, while some aspects of the community discourse leaves a lot to be desired, I did see some pretty cool things on the community forum. I feel like Creative Assembly is getting some very useful feedback here, and part of me thinks that's why they said to bring it to the forum, because anything is better than that stream chat. Is there anything else? Let's see, because there was a lot to talk about, and there was a lot of stuff that happened, and Creative Assembly keeps surprising me. Like, I'm glad I waited until this point to make this video, because it seems like almost every day there was some piece of news. They had a whole like post about like various stuff of the year in review for 2025, and they mentioned more stuff going forward. They mentioned how blood packs are going to be basically bog standard in Total War now. They basically are killing the concept of pre-order factions. So a lot of people's concerns that they were going to have like, say, the Crusaders as like a pre-order thing can kind of rest easy a little bit, at least with that. Again, there's still probably going to be a bunch of DLC factions for Medieval 3. That's something I've kind of made my peace with too. I think that covers everything. I apologize if I missed something. If I did miss anything, I will talk about it in the next video about Medieval 3. So I think we will leave it there. 2026 is going to be an interesting year for Total War, and I'm very intrigued to see how things are going to go with Medieval 3 as it continues down its path of development. So yeah, this is going to be a hell of a journey, my friends. I'm greatly intrigued to see where this goes. So this is probably going to be the last video for 2025, so on behalf of everyone from the MK1212 team, I'd like to wish you guys a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Look forward to 2026, my friends. After all, 2026 is going to be the 12-year anniversary of the mod, and we have a lot of exciting stuff planned for the entire year, so look forward to that. But for now though, I will see you guys later.